Hello, everybody. This is Professor Phillips, Dr. Phillips. Wow, this semester is moving right along. I hope you're finding the class meaningful. I sure am. I'm enjoying the discussions a lot, especially those who pitch in at least a couple times and show me that they're specifically referencing the works and relating it to the overarching theme of human freedom and autonomy. I remember Autumn wrote that she was still struggling with the distinction between these two concepts of personal autonomy, human freedom. And so they are distinct and they are entwined, and it's hard to separate them, but they are separable, they are distinct. So imagine that throughout human history, and very much so today, there are groups of people being subjugated, oppressed, dehumanized, demonized, because they're a specific group of people. And those powers that be try to subjugate them and make sure that they have almost no human freedoms, no freedom of movement, no freedom of expression, and often far, far worse than that. And even so, throughout human history, so many of these souls have engaged in modeled acts of what we can call personal autonomy. They still govern their hearts and their minds, and even within very, very, very restricted, limited circumstances, oppressed circumstances, they act nobly, and they will do anything to show, even if they're almost starving, to share a piece of bread with somebody who's starving even more. There's so many examples. We might look at someone like Nelson Mandela, who was on Robben Island unjustly for 27 years in South Africa, and he was smuggled into him a book about that had a collection of Shakespeare's works, and he formed a reading group around those questions that he found very liberating, even though his movements were restricted, even though it was secret. The guards couldn't know about it. That set his and others' minds free, and when he was finally released, set the stage for many things to come. And in his talks after he became president, he at times referred to some of his readings of Shakespeare. So personal autonomy is still governing your thoughts, your actions, your gestures and disposition towards others, where you refuse to let your oppressors make you less human. In fact, where you show them that you're far more human and far more noble than they could ever hope to be. Because even in your most confined and constricted and restricted and oppressive circumstances, in your way you're still giving, loving, sharing, you have empathy, you're showing that you are far more human than they could ever hope to be. And those acts on your part, even if it's the most seemingly ordinary acts of other circumstances of sharing and caring what teeny bits you have, even if it has a really harmful effect on you by sharing something with others, whether it's food or a book or something that helps others break free from their own shackles. In those kinds of circumstances, you are governing yourself. It's almost the ultimate test. I hope that no one would ever have to live under such circumstances, and yet it does happen. Now, human freedom is, those positive abilities that you live in a society that enables you to express yourself freely, that enables yourself to have socioeconomic mobility, to participate in the political sphere, to weigh in on those questions that are most important to you and on those public matters that are most pressing for you, and to be able to vote or to be able to take other forms of concrete action where there's a deliberate effort, often etched in constitutional law or a Magna Carta or something of that form, to allow you, within government strictures and parameters, to be as free as you can be. If you go to our website, declarationproject.org, you'll see that many of these cries for greater freedom of rights of many, many sorts began with individual or calls among specific groups of people to have rights that seemingly were etched in their constitutions, but they weren't given the right to practice. So I highly invite you to go to our declarationproject.org sites. And from there, people risked many things to realize those freedoms that supposedly were already guaranteed in their constitution. So again, there were these great acts of personal autonomy that said, hey, they recognized the contradictions and hypocrisies, and they wanted the freedoms that were supposedly already meant for them and were legally constituted, and yet they still didn't have those rights. So there's always those people who are willing to put it all on the line, even though some of them, like Dr. King, that you'll be reading about, Malcolm X, that you'll be reading about, lost their lives as a result. But their governance of their self, knowing that their mortal moment might very well be short, was such that they felt that they had to act in a time and clime when they may well have to risk and sacrifice it all for the greater good, to realize human freedoms, liberty, expression, socioeconomic opportunity, educational opportunity, to be able to take part actively and equally in governance that meant so much to them that they were willing to risk it all. And as a result, so many things were achieved. So being able to govern yourself, even under the most limited and restricted circumstances, and act nobly, honorably, thinking about others, not just the generation that's existing today, but generations to come, 1 generation, 5 generations, 100 generations, meant so much to certain people, many of them that we'll never know about. People didn't do it for fame and glory. They did it because they thought it was the right thing to do. These are extraordinary acts of personal autonomy, Antigone-like acts, Socrates-like acts, in the name of human revolution, human evolution, and that's to achieve the ends of greater human freedoms for one and all that can be etched in law. Human rights of freedom of expression, of voting, of being able to be all you can be in many spheres of life, personal and professional. And again, there's no clear boundaries between these. So human freedoms are things that we strive for, typically may take individual acts at first, but the idea is, even if we're lone wolves at first, to touch a chord that resonates. So we get these things etched into law, so these freedoms supposedly are guaranteed. And when they are guaranteed, and when the powers that be don't allow them, then people typically stand up, as they're doing today in many parts of the world, from Hong Kong to Belarus to parts of the USA. And again, we can debate ad nauseum whether certain things are proper exercises of human freedoms or not. In fact, we'll be doing that on our Constitution Day, Constitution Cafe, on September 17th, and looking at what types of freedom of assembly are really legitimate exercises of our First Amendment rights. And we'll be looking at the whole First Amendment, but we'll specifically eventually drill down to that, so I hope many of you will take part. If you need that information, again, even though I sent you the flyer, do let me know. But they are. Human freedom and personal autonomy tend to be entwined, though sometimes it starts with individual acts of people with extraordinary social conscience, imaginative vision, and empathy, who are willing to potentially sacrifice their lives, and they act according to their own law or a higher law, or that they believe that the government ukases and edicts are not such that allow them to be fully human. And so in the name of greater human freedoms, they engage in acts of personal autonomy and self-governance that are never strictly limited to themselves, but begin with themselves, but end, ideally, for achieving greater goods, even if not in their lifetimes and lifetimes to come. And I think one of the reasons personas, real-life personas like Socrates, and fictional personas like Antigone, written by Sophocles in that era, speak to us across the ages and across the cultures, because they give us ideas of who we can still be as human beings. So, I'm going to have some prepared text for you. So I want to first make a little bit of a bridge between Hannah Arendt and that you're reading today. I was already thrilled to get one email from one of you saying that as much Hannah Arendt as you have already read, these 28 pages opened your eyes to some new ideas and thoughts about her. I tend to be able to find things from Hannah Arendt. She was an incredibly prolific and brilliant writer, but she was also an autonomous human being, not just as a professor, but in her actions in the world. These are things that I invite you to read about and to share with us. But she was an extraordinary example as not just as a writer and thinker and scholar, but as an actor in the world who also strived to be, in very difficult times, to be a model of autonomy in ways that could set free the human race as a whole and specific groups of humans. So it's very, very important, I think, that you dig in, and I hope all of you share the same thrill and desire to know more about her, especially after you read this, and maybe want to start doing some searches and at least take a little bit of time to learn more about this incredible soul. I'm going to, let me see, I'm going to go, so when I started Socrates Cafe, which was based on my own notions of Socrates, but others, I was deeply influenced by Hannah Arendt. And she gave me ideas of this Socratic persona that I felt could be emulated in the modern times in the United States when this was in 1996 when I started, and there was deep polarization then. Hannah Arendt's portrayal of Socrates to me was particularly intriguing, and she relates her understanding of Socrates to what would seem to be indisputably one of the most central concerns facing modernity. Whether there is a future beyond modernity may lie with the insights gained from the issues that Hannah Arendt unflinchingly explores. And there's an essay that I came across called Thinking and Moral Consideration by Arendt that I think you could just do a Google search and find it. But she examined the interconnection between the ability or inability to think and the problem of evil. And then Arendt wrote about this in her very famous essay, Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil, in 1963, that left her with lingering questions. Her book dealt with the trial of the former Nazi officer Adolf Eichmann, sometimes called the architect of the Holocaust, for crimes against Jews, crimes of humanity, and crimes of war. And Eichmann stood trial in Israel after his capture in Argentina and was found guilty and hanged. Arendt attended the trial of Eichmann, and she recounts in her work, The Life of the Mind, which was published in 1978, that she was amazed to find Eichmann, quote unquote, quite ordinary, commonplace, and neither demonic nor monstrous, unquote. What Arendt discerned in witnessing Eichmann's testimony was that he possessed, quote, not stupidity, but a curious, quite authentic inability to think, unquote. She concluded that Eichmann's utter incapacity to think enabled him to perpetrate the greatest evil without the least twinge or stir of conscience, much less moral compunction to do otherwise. So to Arendt, he was the epitome of thoughtlessness, a veritable non-thinker. To her, the trouble, she wrote, with Eichmann was precisely that so many were like him, and that the many were neither perverted nor sadistic, that they were and still are terribly, in spite of being those things, and that they were, quote unquote, terribly and terrifyingly normal in many respects. And she wrote that this normality was much more terrifying in some aspects than all the atrocities put together, for it implied that this new type of criminal commits his crimes under circumstances that make it well nigh impossible for him to know or to feel that he is doing wrong, unquote. So going back to this essay that I referred to called Thinking and Moral Consideration, in contemplating the connection between thinking itself and evil, Arendt doesn't say that if we can become adept at thinking, we will necessarily avoid doing evil or avert others from doing so. Rather, she is saying that only with an ingrained thinking capacity can we then make a conscientious judgment about whether to do good or evil ourselves. And in the case of Adolf Eichmann and all those like him, whom she found to be devoid of such a capacity for thinking at all, and hence for making judgments, it was no great leap in Arendt's estimation for them to fall prey to fanaticism, to become perpetrators of the greatest of evil, acts of evil. So consequently, Arendt pondered how ordinary or everyday people might develop those thinking capacities that can imbue them with the ability to judge whether they should or should not go along with attempts at committing such evils. How, Hannah Arendt asked, can everyday people, people like me, how can we learn to think for ourselves? Since thinking is itself, in Arendt's estimation, one of the primary conditions that enables us to make judgments, how can this capacity be developed on a pervasive scale? And from her own initial explorations into key questions such as, is our ability to judge, to tell right from wrong, dependent upon our faculty of thought? Do the inability to think and a disastrous failure of what we commonly call conscience coincide? And Arendt says another, quote, question posed itself. Could the activity of thinking itself, of thinking as such, the habit of examining and reflecting upon whatever happens to come to pass, regardless of specific content and quite independent of results, could this activity be of such a nature that it conditions men against evil doing? Her answer is that it can, if we strive to become exemplars of the type of persona modeled by Socrates. So Arendt believes, as she states in The Life of a Mind, that the historical Socrates, as you read about in the Apology, represented the quintessential example of a thinker who was not a professional or expert, but who in his person, unified two apparently contradictory passions for thinking and for action, not in the sense of being eager to apply his thoughts or establish theoretical standards for action, but in the more relevant sense of being equally at home in both spheres and able to move easily and deftly and adeptly from one sphere to the other. Very much as we ourselves, you and me, constantly move back and forth between experiences and the world of appearances and the need for reflecting on these experiences. She says Socrates was a man who counted himself neither among the many nor among the few, who had no aspiration to be a ruler of men, no claim even to be particularly well fitted by a superior wisdom to act in an advisory capacity to those in power, but not a man who submitted meekly to being ruled either. In brief, Socrates, she says, was a thinker who always remained a human among men, a man among men who did not shun the marketplace, the public agora where you exchange ideas and ideals, but who was a citizen among citizens, doing nothing, claiming nothing, except what in his opinion every citizen should be and have a right to be. So here was her epitome of a person who combined both personal autonomy and an exemplar of human freedom who strive to push outward the boundaries of human freedoms for thought and action. Eventually, hopefully, to have them etched in law, though he failed in his own time. He was a tragic hero, but he spoke to us across the ages because he fought the good fight. He tried for all of us. So Socrates, to Arendt, was her ideal of every man or every person, a paragon of thinking of which all of us are capable, and that's what she wants to really stress. This is not to say that we will automatically, as a result of trying to emulate in our own singular way, trying to emulate Socrates, to fend off evil, much less not commit evil ourselves. Rather, it's to say that only when we have such a thinking capacity can we make a choice. So thinking like Socrates, to Arendt, is no safeguard in itself with its quote-unquote undermining effect on all established criteria, values, measurements for good and evil, in short, on those customs and rules of conduct we treat of in morals and ethics. But, she says, it's from this undermining effect that one can then choose to construct an autonomously positive, humanizing ethic that begins with us, but that by no means ends with us, that seeks to expand ever upward and outward the circle of what human freedom can be and amount to, by making sure that when we do ask and act in the world, that we're doing so in a way that we hope will resonate with others and hope will become the human norms and become etched in law. And for instance, in our society's own First Amendment, in our Constitution. And then in another essay of Arendt's called Politics and Philosophy and Politics, she lauds Socrates' autonomy, his capacity, and for those who are still struggling with the distinction, listen to this, his capacity for inculcating a type of moral individualism that at the same time was not self-centered or self-aggrandizing, but that enabled Socrates, or anybody who strives to be like that, to develop the qualities that made him not simply a great thinker, but a great citizen. Arendt believes this singular ability of Socrates that he mastered to engage in internal dialogue and thus judge each situation as it presented itself is a critical ingredient for developing the type of autonomous persona imbued with a social conscience necessary to be a good democratic citizen. She writes, only someone who has had the experience of having a dialogue, talking with himself, is capable of being a friend, of acquiring another self, of forging the type of philia, communal love, friendship love, love of society and one's fellow members, that constantly expands outward one's circle of friends in the civic sphere, the public sphere, and not just private dimensions. So we are constantly making judgments within the context of what is happening in society at large, and doing so and trying to be what she would call a democratic enabler of sorts. So we're always not just thinking about ourselves but others, and wanting to make sure that our acts in the world are such that we want to see to it in our own way, all of us flawed and foibled, and yet striving for ideals that enable everybody to develop, discover, and contribute those talents of theirs that can evolve what it means to be a human being, and to have certain rights etched into law, so we don't have to act with the kind of fear that so many have had to over the millennia, to give us the rights that so many unfortunately take for granted today. And that leads us to your 28-page reading of Arendt, which I'm glad at least one of you so far has already told me that it was quite eye-opening. I mean, it's a brilliant, concise exploration of concepts of revolution. Revolution is restoration, of liberation, and again, how these concepts are entwined. They are separable, but they're also entwined. She goes into the 1651 concept of revolution, defined as freedom by God's blessing restored. In other words, rights taken away from you that you are restoring. And then that's revolution, that the people stand up to and rise up against. So revolution, by her conception, originally meant restoration of freedoms. And so the word revolutionary can be applied, she said, only to revolutions whose aim is freedom. And she says that what happened at the end of the 18th century, as you've already seen if you've already read it, was that an attempt at restoration was a recovery of old rights and privileges. But that resulted, again, remember what I talked about in my previous lecture, the law of unintended consequences? A progressive, in its exact opposite. It led to a progressive development and the opening up of a future, quote unquote, which defied all further attempts at acting or thinking in terms of a circular revolving motion. So it led to other things, to other forms of freedom. We set ideas for ourselves, but as we act in the world and try to realize those ideas and ideals, they evolve and they change, hopefully for the better. So something more complex happened, as she writes, with the term freedom. It was the political right. It wasn't just about restoring civil rights. It also became the political right to participate in public affairs. Quote unquote, liberty meant more than freedom from unjustifiable restraint. It became more and more of a positive thing. Liberation was a condition of freedom, but by no means is it guaranteed that with liberation comes freedom. So it's an underlying factor. It's a pre-existing necessary condition, but liberation doesn't necessarily mean that that's what you'll achieve. It's difficult to see and say, she says, where the desire for liberation to be free from oppression ends, and the desire for freedom to live a full political life and participate in the public sphere begins. And she looks at the French and American revolutions. She notes that the French Revolution was a failure in so many aspects. In the American Revolution, she says, even though their beginnings were so similar, they ended so differently. One more aspect of freedom came to the fore, she notes, during the revolutions. The idea of freedom and the actual experience of making a new beginning in the historical continuum, she notes, coincides. So it's not just the abolition of personal rule and the admission in the public sphere. And she refers, and I hope that many of you, I'm not going to say what it is, I hope some of you actually mention the poem of Antiquity that she mentions in this work. And so that you reflect on it and respond to it in your own discussions and participation in the discussion list of this week, because I think it's very important that you do so. But she refers to the birth of a new era, the beginning of something new that this poem of Antiquity relates to. And that's what it's all about, keeping your eyes on the prize. That's really the ideal and the epitome of when you combine liberation, revolution, and freedom. That's what it amounts to. The beginning of something new. The beginning of new possibilities for what freedom and autonomy can be all about. And it's a brilliant thing that she writes about there. And I hope some of you will share the poem of Antiquity on our discussion list and will then apply your own thinking to it. And tell us what you think and how maybe you might or others might apply it in their own time and clime. There was one other thing before I leave you. This is like my longest lecture, right? And let's see if I find it. So here's the thing. Hannah Arendt has been central in all of my work, practical and scholarly, over the years. She also makes the intriguing assertion. So again, revolution, the notion of it, was about restoring rights that you once had, civic rights. And then it also became about achieving political rights so you could participate in the public sphere and weigh in on those matters that meant the most to you and take action as a result. But she also makes the intriguing assertion that our entrance into this world as babies is not what matters most when it comes to personhood. While our beginning as an individual, Arendt asserts in her very known work, The Origins of Totalitarianism, is guaranteed by each new birth. This is just the first step. But there must be, she argues, an ongoing birthing process, what she calls, quote unquote, a second birth, which she claims can only be had if and when we develop a political stance in the world and have the freedom, the human freedom, to act on this stance. So there's people of personal autonomy, even when it's against the law, they give themselves license, they give themselves the freedom to act on this stance, but the idea and the goal is always to eventually have it etched in law so everybody can do it. So we can take it for granted today what our founding fathers and mothers did for us. So this, for Hannah Arendt, to have the freedom to act on our political stances, is the moment of true birth, because it's the moment when the possibility, she says, for true creation and liberation arrives. We can take our place as a unique self in a world among other unique selves. As she puts it in the human condition, quote unquote, with word and deed, we insert ourselves into the human world, and this insertion is like a second birth. And I write about this in my book, A Child at Heart. She writes, when we are denied the ability to insert ourselves, when we are kept from taking our place at the political table, or family table for that matter, as one among equals, we're existentially stillborn. We can't become full-fledged citizens, persons. Those on the receiving end, those who engage in deliberate acts of rejection and exclusion, will never be treated as equals unless and until those denying them their place at the table come to realize that they are also keeping themselves from being full-fledged persons. I'm going to read that again. In other words, those who strive to be the masters and to keep others down almost as slaves, to subjugate them, they're also keeping themselves down. When you liberate and actively strive to liberate others, when you actively strive to create the fertile conditions in society that enable everyone to discover, develop, and contribute their talents, you are further liberating yourselves. When you actively strive to create conditions that restrict others, that limit what others can do, you are also limiting yourself. It's a profound point. Her point is their acts of inhumanity to others not only prevent the unfolding and flourishing and blossoming and self-realization of others, but of themselves. And there's very few more profound thoughts that you can come across than that by Arendt. I'm going to have to say, since I post this on public, because Canvas is horrendous when it comes to posting videos, that this is copyrighted stuff, this is Chris Phillips-y stuff, and I can, so get my permission, anyone above and beyond my students. I'll keep this online in public for a week because I don't know any other way to do it. But I hope you found this interesting. This was a much longer lecture than I've given before, but I thought it was vital to make the bridge between Socrates, between Socrates of the Apology that you wrote about, and Arendt's notions of Socrates, the person, and of the thinking person in general, how it springs from that, to your reading of Hannah Arendt's work on human freedom, the 28 pages that combine these rich conceptions. And remember, these concepts are values laden. They're always changing, of freedom, of revolution, of liberation, and then of what that means, what that can mean, and how anybody who actively attempts to subjugate others in her extraordinary point of view is also subjugating themselves. But that the second birth can only take place when we are equal players at the political table as well, not just for, in the civic sphere, but at having those direct political rights where we are equals and we can act on and in the world as equals. I don't know of many more profound points that can be made of that, and I hope you'll think about that and apply it to your works, and think about how you, no matter what you decide to do with your lives, how important and relevant it is. Okay, thanks a lot.